Exception handling or error handling is an important aspect when building applications. Even though we want our applications to work completely fine, there are always going to be unexpected cases and scenarios. It's very important that we handle these cases and return back valid messages. This is also same when we build API applications. In this video, let's learn about exception handling in ASP.NET Core Applications and the different ways we can handle exceptions. I will show you how to set up global error handling and how to set the middleware that's required for that. Now, one of the feedback that I received for the videos was to show more real-world examples. So I will try and include some examples from that aspect as well. Hello everyone, welcome back to this channel. If you are new here, my name is Rahul and I make videos around .NET, Azure and DevOps. Now if this is of interest to you, please make sure to hit the subscribe button because that will really help me to grow this channel. As usual, without much delay, let's head straight into my command line to create the new project. But wait, why do I use command line always to create the project? Is it because it looks cool? Or is it the only way to create projects? The reason why I use command line to set up these projects is because it's less clicks to set up the project and it's much faster when I'm showing this video. Usually my intent is just to set up a blank API template or a blank React application. But in no ways does it mean that using a command line is the only way you can create a project. Nor does it mean that if you don't use a command line, it's not appropriate or it makes you a lesser or a better of developer. Now one of my friends asked this, so I thought I should be mentioning this in the video. So for a change, let's use the GUI tool to create the new project. So let's close this and open up Rider, which is the IDE that I usually use. I'll click the new solution and choose the ASP.NET Core Web Application to create a new solution. Now in this case, I simply need an API template. So let's use the type and specify Web API. Now this is having a solution name and a project name. So let's call this exception handling. And let's name the project as API. So there will be a solution with the name exception handling and a project with .api. Let's click create. I have the project all set up and we have the solution file and the project file in here. Now to avoid these multiple click steps and naming is why I usually use the command line because it's just faster and comes straight to the point. So I have the new project opened up here with the default API template, which has the program.cs, the startup.cs, and also the weather forecast controller. Now inside this controller, it returns back a list of weather data that is hard-coded whenever we make a call to the get method. To start learning about exception handling, let's first create some exceptions. So let's take in a string city name for this method. So let's collapse the sidebar and use string city name. In this case, let's assume when the city name is a specific city, so let's say city name is equal to Sydney. In this case, we don't have valid weather data. So let's throw a new exception. So let's say throw new exception and specify the message no weather data for Sydney. Let's run this application and see how this is working. So let's press F5. The application is running, so I'm hitting the weather forecast endpoint. And since there is no city name by default, I'm getting back a list of weather data. Now let's make a call with the city name as Sydney. So let's specify question mark and city name is equal to Sydney. So let's just pass in the value as text. Now if you're not sure how the city name is getting bound to the variable, you can check out my video on model binding, which will be linked here or in the description below. To continue with our exception handling, you can see that we have got back an exception message which specifies no weather data for Sydney. We also get a lot more information about the exception. So this is the exact position in which the exception was thrown, the query that was passed, the cookies that was available, the headers and the routing information. Now this is a lot of detailed information in the exception that's getting returned back. If we navigate back to our Rider project and stop this, let's navigate to the startup.cs class. Here we can see there is one line that is when the environment is development, we set up the developer exception page. Now this is exactly the reason why we see that detailed exception page. If we navigate into this method Rider shows the details of this implementation. So here we can see we are using a middleware, which is the developer exception page middleware. This is responsible in showing that detailed information that we just saw in the browser. Now, depending on how we call this endpoint, this also formats the response slightly differently. To show that, let me open up a tool which is called Postman, which allows us to make API request. It's freely available on the internet, and I'll make sure to drop a link in the description to download this. Once Postman is opened up, you can use the plus button here to make a new request. So if I navigate back to the URL, copy this, and come back to Postman, I can paste in this inside the get request. Now since this is a get endpoint, I can simply make a get request. Now clicking send, it is going to return back the same exception message. So we have the system.exception, no weather data, and all the details in here. You can also click between the raw, preview, and visualize tabs to see the different formats of this particular message. Now in this particular case, it is returned back as a raw text. If I navigate into the header section, I can specify the accept header to specify that I can also accept a text/HTML. Since I cannot modify this existing header, let's create a new header inside here. So let's call this accept and specify I can get back a text/HTML. So using this, I am specifying that you can return me back an HTML format. Now if I click send again, it's going to return back the data as HTML. So looking at the pretty formatted or the preview, you can see the exact response message that we saw in the browser, because by default, the browser was sending text/HTML. Now these are the different formats that's available. If we navigate back into Rider and navigate into the middleware class, we can see this is handled inside here. So if we scroll down, we can see there is an explicit check for the accept header, and then it uses the appropriate response. So here, inside the display exception method, in the developer exception page middleware class, we can see it checks for the accept header. So depending on it being text or HTML, it formats the response appropriately. Coming back to startup.cs, let's close all other tabs and just have that class. The use developer exception page is enabled only when it is a development environment. Usually, it's a good practice to not share detailed exception messages and stack traces when returning back your error messages. This is the reason why it's enabled only for the development environment. Now, how does ASP.NET Core know which environment you are running on? It uses the properties and launch settings.json file. Inside here, we have an environment, ASP.NET Core environment. This is available on the two profiles, the IIS Express and the project profile. Depending on the profile you are running, it will pick up the appropriate environment variable. So let's go ahead and change the ASP.NET Core environment in here to be production or even test environment. So let's call this test, for example. And in Rider, you can choose the profiles up on this right side. And this is very much the same in any other development environment. When you run, you will have an option to choose the profile that you need to run against. So by default, it's using the API profile. So let's use that and run this again. The application is running as expected. So let's pass in the city name Sydney. This now returns a simple 500 message. If you look at the Postman request and make this request again, this is also going to return just a 500 message. If you look at the pretty messages, there's no messages now available. The error code, however, is returned as 500 internal server error. Now this is because the application now is running inside the test environment, which we had set up in this file, and the developer exception middleware is not enabled for that particular environment. Now the ASP.NET Core runtime is handling this internal server error of ours because it is throwing an unhandled exception. So it returns back a server error. So how do we start handling and formatting these exceptions? The simplest way to handle these exceptions is to navigate into the weather forecast controller and simply add a try catch inside of this method. Even though in this case the exception is thrown right inside this method, it could also be thrown from a deeper class like a repository or a service class which is in a different file. So we can add a try catch around this code block and handle any exceptions that is thrown. So let's select the entire method code and wrap this with a try catch block. So I'll use a keyboard shortcut which is Alt Enter and then say surround with and specify try catch. So this surrounds the entire method call with a try-catch exception method. For now, I will just catch the exception class, which will handle all the exceptions that can be thrown, because everything inherits from the base class, which is exception. In this specific case, let's return back a bad request because that is exactly what we are throwing. So let's specify a bad request result and specify the message as well. So we can use e.message to get the message. Now since we have modified the return type, we cannot just return an I enumerable because the bad request is not matching type. Now if you are not familiar with the return types of the API, you can check out my video which details out on the different possibilities. It will be linked here and in the description below. Now to fix this, the only thing I need to do is to come here and say action result and use that as the return type. Let's specify the T in here and this compiles perfectly fine. Let's run this application again and see how this is working now. The application is running, so let me refresh this request. And now you can see there is a message, no weather data for Sydney. If you look at the F12 tab, you can also look at the network tab to see the API request. So let's make a request again, and we see that this is returning a 400 error, which is a bad request. You can also preview the text and the other response parameters from these tabs. Coming back to rider, if we change this bad request to be not found, this is going to return back a different error code. So let's run this again to see that in action. The application is running, and now in this case, you can see this is returning a 404, which is not found, which might be more appropriate in our current scenario because it says that the city name Sydney is not found. This works great, and we are able to handle these exceptions and return back the messages that we want. But fast forward this into your application where you have lots of endpoints and lot of different exceptions that's going to happen and that you want to handle and return appropriate messages. You will also want to maintain some kind of a consistency so that it can be all changed at a single point. So what we now want is to move this up into a single point where you can handle this consistently. To do that, let's use the middleware. So I had covered about middleware in a previous video, and if you want to learn that, you can check that out here. In this case, I'll walk you through on setting up an exception handling middleware inside this application. Open the sidebar and create a new class. Let's call this exception handling middleware. So let's make sure it is a class and say exception handling middleware. Now there are different types of creating a custom middleware. I will use the one which is using an interface. If you're not familiar, do make sure to check the other video linked before. So let's use the iMiddleware interface, which has a method that needs to be implemented. So this takes in an HTTP context and also the next delegate. So this is the next middleware inside the pipeline. So middleware is nothing but a stack of code blocks which can be run one after the other. So wherever in the pipeline we inject this middleware, the request delegate will have the next middleware inside this pipeline. The context gives us the context on the HTTP request. So in here, all we need to do is to try and catch the next method call. Because if there is any exception happening inside the next request, I just need to handle that in here. So let's add a try catch block and call the method into the next middleware. So all we need to do is to say await and call next, passing in the context again. Because this is the exact context that the next method will also require. Now since this is an await, I need to make sure that I need to add an async. Now I can use the alt enter in rider and specify that make this to be async. Now once this is called, we just need to handle the exception message. So earlier in our example, we explicitly returned a not found message. So in here, if we want to do exactly the same, let's specify context.response and start setting the status code for that. So let's specify status code is equal to HTTP status code and use the status code from there, which is not found. Now since this expects an integer, we can cast this into an int. We can also set up the message. So let's say context.response and say write async and pass in the exception message in this particular case. Since this is a write async, we need to make sure to add the await call again. So now here, the code that we had in the API is centralized inside this location, even though I'm hard coding it to be not found, which we will fix in a while later. So let's navigate to our weather forecast controller and we can remove this try catch block since this will be handled inside the middleware. So let's remove all this code that we just wrote and make sure to format this. Now with the middleware class written, let's go to startup.cs to register the middleware. So to start with, we need to first inject this particular middleware into the dependency injection controller. That is done inside the configure services method, where we can use services and specify add methods. If you're new to dependency injection in ASP.NET Core, I highly recommend the video linked here or in the description below. So let's say transient and specify the middleware, which is the exception handler middleware that we just created. So let's just specify the type and close this brackets. Now this method is only setting up it into the service collection. So let's make sure to scroll down into the configure method and set it up inside the middleware pipeline. So right after routing, let's specify app.useMiddleware and specify the class that we just wrote. In this case, it is exception handling middleware. So this is adding this custom middleware into this ASP.NET Core request pipeline. So we have everything set up. Let's go to the middleware and put a breakpoint inside here to see what exactly is happening. Let's press F5. The application is running successfully. So let's pass in the city name Sydney. So let's specify city name is equal to Sydney. Since we had the breakpoint inside the exception method, it has stopped the execution there. Now if we look at this exception message, we can see this is thrown from no weather data for Sydney. Now in this particular case, this is returning the status code not found and setting the response message. So if we continue the execution, we get back the response, which is no weather data for Sydney. Now I have moved all the exception handling code and the formatting of that inside the global middleware handler. However, in this particular scenario, I am handling all exceptions and returning a blanket not found exception. This might not be appropriate. Some of the errors might be validation errors. Some others might be just purely unhandled server errors, in which case you need to return a 500. Let's see how we can handle these. To make it more real world kind of an example, let's first refactor this code into a different project. In an earlier video on layering, I had shown how to organize your project structure. So let's extract the domain related logic, which is about the weather data, into a separate project. So let's go ahead and create a new project. So let's say add new project. I just need a class library. So I can call this as exception handling .domain. Now this is the domain related logic for this particular project. So let's click create, and this has created a new project. Since this application is related with weather information, let's drag the weather forecast class inside the domain class. Now I'm going to move that file inside the domain project. I'll navigate to the weather forecast and make sure to fix this namespace. Now since I want to get the weather data, which might typically be a weather service class, let's rename this class 1 to be a weather service class. So let's call this weather service and also rename this to match exactly that. Now we can also add in an interface if you require. So let's say public interface weather service and add in a method for getting the weather. So let's add task of enumerable of weather forecast, which is now coming from the domain class, and specify the get method along with the string city name. Now this is the interface. Let's make sure to include the missing references and implement this inside the weather service class. So let's make sure to implement the missing methods, and this returns all the dummy data in this particular case. So let's navigate to the weather forecast controller, copy out this code, which is returning the hard-coded data. So let's copy that inside of this weather service method. Now let's include the missing references, navigate back. Since we don't need this anymore, let's delete that and copy this static list of strings that we have. So copying that inside the class, we have all this functionality created up here as well. Now since I don't have any async and await, I can fairly remove this task from here. And also from this method implementation, and it compiles as expected. So let's specify enumerable of weather forecast. Let's make sure to implement the generic interface as well, so that let's import the missing references. Now this compiles perfectly fine. So let's navigate back into the controller and inject in the weather service. So along with the logger, let's add in an weather service implementation as well. So let's say weather service, which now comes from the other project. So let's make sure to reference that project from the API project as well. So let's specify that and say weather service. Let's add a backing property for this, scroll down and call this particular method from the weather service. So let's say underscore weather service dot get and pass in the city name. The action result requires a concrete type to be returned. So let's call toArray in this particular case. So this works perfectly fine. So now everything is compiling. So next navigate to the startup.cs. Make sure to register the iWeather service. So under the services again, we can call services.addTransient and specify the iWeather service and specify the implementation as weather service class. This will make sure that the weather service is dependency injected into the weather forecast controller. Now, if any of this is feeling too fast, I highly recommend checking out my layering video in where I show this in detail and explain the details around why I do this in this particular way. Let's build this to make sure everything is working fine. The build is successful, so let's run this application to see this in action. The application is still working as expected, so let's add in the city name. This is working exactly as before and we are still handling the exception class. Now inside the domain, we can start adding in custom domain exceptions. These are very specific to our domain and not generic as exception or argument exception, for example. So going back into the domain class, we can create a new folder and keep all our exceptions inside one folder. So let's click directory and specify this as exception. You can choose to manage your exceptions however you prefer. Let's create a new class inside here and call this as domain exception. Now this is going to be our base exception class inside this domain. So let's create that class and inherit this from the exception class. We can add in a constructor if we want and specify a default message always. Now this depends on how you want to format and respond back with all the exceptions, what details you want to include, and how you want to track your exception request. Maybe you want to add in a request ID or a tracking ID that you can pass back, which you can always log and make sure what happened with that particular exception. Now, depending on what your requirements are, this will change. Now, in this particular case, I can simply pass on this message to the base exception class. Let's make sure to include the appropriate references for the exceptions. So let's say import missing references and pass on this message onto the base class. For that, let's call base and pass in the message to it. Now, if you don't want anyone to create a class of this type, but further divide this into specific domain exceptions, we can mark this class as abstract and then create more specific classes for our need. Now, looking back at our example, we had a not found exception. So let's call this as public class and name this as domain not found exception. And also inherit this from the domain exception that we just created. So let's have a specific class for not found and make sure to include the constructor as required. So let's pass in the message and take in the base and call the message again. So this is going to pass in this message inside to the domain exception, which is going to further send this to the exception class. Now, like I said before, you can add in any more details inside these constructors and also this object that is relevant for your application. Now, if we want to start using this, so let's say domain not found, we can navigate back to our weather service and instead of throwing the exception, we can say domain not found exception. Make sure to include the appropriate references. Navigate to our exception handling middleware. Now it makes more sense to handle this as a domain not found exception. And since this is a domain not found exception, it makes sense to have the not found as the status code. We can also catch a blanket exception method, which is getting caught in case it's some other kind of exception. So let's say catch exception and again name this as E and use this again. In this case, since this is an unhandled exception, I can set up the response.status code to be 500. I can similarly write await.context.response.writeAsync and pass in just the message. Let's run this. We still have the breakpoint there. Let's see how that works now. The application is running successfully. So let me pass in the city name Sydney. And now we have the breakpoint hit at domain not found exception. So this is going to set this as not found and then respond back with this response. Now navigating back, we see this message, no weather data for Sydney. If you look at the network tab, we can see this is still the 404, which is not found in our case. Now if we navigate back into our source code, and if this was throwing a different exception, so let's go into the weather service and throw in a different exception. So we can always go inside this exception class and create a new class. So let's copy this and say this is now going to be a validation exception. So instead of domain not found, we create a new class which is validation exception. Now this could have validation errors from your class as you expect. Now if we come back and throw a validation exception here, since we don't have this handled inside our global controller, it's going to return a 500 in this particular case. So let's run this to make sure that's exactly what happens. The application is running. Let's refresh this call. And this now returns a 500 exception. This is because inside the global exception handling middleware, it is not matching the domain not found exception. So then it falls back to the exception class and sets that as 500. Now, in your case, if you want to respond back with a bad request in case of validation errors, you can simply come here, add a catch, and specify the validation exception, and specify E to capture that as well. Now here we'll simply return back the same, but make the status code as bad request. So if you are unsure of the status code, you can use HTTP status code and specify bad request. So in this case, make sure to cast this to an integer. Now going back to this validation exception class, I would prefix this with domain so that it is consistent. Let's make sure to apply this naming refactoring everywhere. So going back, we have this as domain validation exception as well. Let's stop and rerun this application again to see how this works now. The application is running, so let's refresh this again. And this time I get back a 400, which is a bad request. This is because the API is throwing a domain validation exception and the global middleware is explicitly handling for that. I hope this helps you to understand more about exception handling and the different ways of handling exceptions inside your ASP.NET Core applications. We learned about how you can handle this at the controller level and why that is not a great idea to do, and also moving this up inside a global error handler. We learned how in a real-life application you could have custom domain classes for exceptions and use that to handle inside your middleware. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. If you have any feedback or questions, please make sure to drop in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because that really helps me to grow this YouTube channel. And I'm almost nearing the 5K mark as I record this particular video. And I'm really excited for that. Thank you and see you soon.